The most dangerous person in Pride and Prejudice may not be Lady Catherine de Bourgh. In fact, the more unsettling possibility is that she was one of the few people who understood exactly what was at stake. That sounds absurd at first. After all, Lady Catherine is usually remembered as the embodiment of arrogance, privilege, and social control. She stands in opposition to personal freedom. She resists change. She tries to preserve a world built on hierarchy. But what if we have been asking the wrong question? What if the real issue was never whether Lady Catherine was right or wrong? What if the deeper question is this: what happens when people stop believing in the invisible rules that hold a society together? Because from Lady Catherine's perspective, the problem was never a single marriage. The problem was the precedent. Every civilization depends on structures that most people rarely notice. Not physical structures. Invisible ones. Ideas. Expectations. Boundaries. Assumptions. The shared belief that certain roles belong to certain people, that certain responsibilities follow certain positions, that society itself has a shape that should not be casually rearranged. And here is the contradiction. Modern audiences often celebrate those who challenge the system. We admire rebels. We admire individuals who refuse to stay in the place assigned to them. We see resistance as courage. Yet every stable civilization in history was built by people who believed the opposite. People who believed that order mattered more than individual preference. People who believed that boundaries existed for a reason. People who believed that once enough exceptions are allowed, the rules themselves begin to lose meaning. Lady Catherine represents that mindset. Not as a villain. Not even primarily as a person. But as a role. She is a gatekeeper standing before an invisible door. And that door is one of the most important memory fragments in this entire story. Imagine the gates of Rosings Park. Not merely as the entrance to an estate, but as a symbol. A line separating two realities. On one side stands a world organized by inheritance, obligation, and continuity. On the other stands a world increasingly shaped by individual judgment and personal choice. Lady Catherine's significance comes from the fact that she understands something most characters never articulate. Power does not survive because powerful people are strong. Power survives because people believe the structure is legitimate. The moment legitimacy begins to crack, authority becomes fragile. And suddenly, what appears to be a personal decision starts looking like something much larger. A tiny fracture in a much larger wall. But here is where the mystery deepens. Was Lady Catherine defending privilege? Or was she defending a model of reality itself? Because those are not necessarily the same thing. Throughout history, societies have repeatedly depended on collective fictions, shared assumptions that transform millions of individuals into a functioning civilization. Money has value because people believe it does. Institutions endure because people trust them. Social order exists because enough people agree that it exists. Remove the belief, and the structure begins to wobble. Remove enough belief, and entire eras disappear. Which raises a disturbing possibility. Maybe Lady Catherine's greatest fear was never Elizabeth Bennet. Maybe her greatest fear was the future. A future in which the old boundaries no longer command obedience. A future in which people begin asking why the walls exist at all. And if that is true, then the conflict in front of us is no longer about class status or marriage. It becomes a question every civilization eventually faces. How do you know whether a boundary is protecting the world, or preventing the next world from being born? But there is another layer to this conflict that is even more difficult to see. What if the real divide was never between freedom and control? What if it was between two completely different definitions of responsibility? Because modern audiences often interpret Lady Catherine through the language of power. We assume that powerful people act primarily to preserve their own advantages. Sometimes that is true. But stable systems rarely survive for centuries through self-interest alone. They survive because enough people genuinely believe they are protecting something larger than themselves. And that is where the conflict becomes fascinating. Lady Catherine does not operate as a conqueror. She operates as a custodian, a caretaker, A guardian standing watch over a structure she inherited rather than created. The distinction matters. Because if someone believes they are defending a civilization rather than merely defending themselves, compromise becomes much harder. Suddenly every challenge looks larger than it really is. Every exception feels dangerous. Every crack in the wall feels like the beginning of collapse. This is why the invisible wall itself becomes one of the most important memory fragments in the story. Most walls are easy to recognize. Stone walls, castle walls, prison walls. But the strongest walls in human history have usually been invisible. Customs, norms, expectations, shared assumptions about who belongs where. The strange thing is that these walls often feel unnecessary right before they disappear. And that creates a profound contradiction. When a system is functioning well, its underlying structure becomes almost invisible. People stop noticing the framework holding everything together. They begin to believe the framework is unnecessary. Then, when someone questions a boundary, the challenge appears harmless. Reasonable, even. But from the perspective of a guardian, the issue is never the single challenge. It is the chain reaction. Because history rarely changes all at once. It changes through legitimacy. One assumption falls. Then another. Then another. And eventually an entire generation begins seeing the world differently. This is where Elizabeth's symbolic role becomes larger than the individual herself. She represents something that appears repeatedly throughout history. The moment when personal judgment starts competing with inherited authority. Not rebellion for its own sake. Not destruction. Something far more transformative. The belief that truth can be discovered independently of the system that produced you. And once that idea enters a society, everything changes. Family structures change. Institutions change. Political systems change. Even morality begins to shift. A decision that once looked personal suddenly acquires civilizational consequences. Now the scale expands again. Because this pattern is not unique to Regency England. You can find it in religious reformations, political revolutions, economic transformations, technological disruptions. Again and again, history introduces individuals who challenge an inherited map of reality. And again, guardians emerge to resist them. Which creates another mystery. What if both sides are necessary? What if societies need challengers to evolve, but also need guardians to prevent evolution from becoming chaos? Because every breakthrough destroys something. Every reform weakens an older certainty. Every new world is built from the decline of another. That is why the image of the empty throne becomes so powerful. Not a throne occupied by a ruler. An empty throne. A symbol of authority itself. The deeper question is not who sits on it. The deeper question is what happens when people stop believing the throne means anything at all. And that leads us toward an even more unsettling possibility. Maybe the greatest civilizations do not collapse when they lose power. Maybe they collapse when they lose the shared stories that once made power appear legitimate. And if that is true, then we are forced to confront a far more difficult question. How can anyone tell the difference between a social myth that protects civilization and a social myth that has outlived its time? If guardians and challengers are both necessary, then we arrive at a problem that is far more uncomfortable than choosing sides. What if the real danger appears when neither side understands its own limits? Because every social order contains a hidden contradiction. The people who preserve it often believe the system is more permanent than it actually is. The people who challenge it often believe the system is more fragile than it actually is. And history shows that both assumptions can be catastrophically wrong. This is where Lady Catherine becomes more interesting as a symbol than as a character. She represents a pattern that appears whenever an established world begins sensing a shift it cannot fully control. Not a ruler. Not an architect. A censor. An early warning system. Someone who detects instability before everyone else notices it. That role creates a strange paradox. The guardian is often the first person to recognize change. But because they recognize it first, they are also the first person to resist it. and resistance itself creates escalation. The more forcefully a system defends its boundaries, the more attention those boundaries attract. The more attention they attract, the more people begin questioning why they exist. The invisible wall suddenly becomes visible. And once people can see a wall, they begin imagining life beyond it. That is the contradiction at the center of every aging order. Attempts to preserve legitimacy can unintentionally expose its weaknesses. This is why another memory fragment matters here. The image is not a battle, not an argument, not even a decision. It is a crack. A tiny crack in a stone structure that still appears strong from a distance. At first, nobody worries. The building remains standing. The walls remain upright. Life continues. But those who maintain the structure understand something everyone else ignores. Collapse rarely begins when a wall falls. Collapse begins when confidence falls. That insight changes the scale of the entire discussion. Because the deepest foundations of civilization are psychological. A government can survive economic hardship. A culture can survive conflict. An institution can survive mistakes. But no structure survives indefinitely after losing legitimacy in the minds of the people who sustain it. And suddenly the conflict becomes larger than class. Larger than status. Larger than a single historical moment. It becomes a question about human nature itself. How much of reality is objective? And how much of reality depends upon collective belief? After all, every society is filled with things that exist because people agree they exist. Laws, ranks, titles, traditions, norms. These are not mountains or rivers. They are shared interpretations, shared stories, shared commitments. And yet they shape human behavior more powerfully than many physical objects ever could. But here is the revelation that creates the real crisis. A social structure can become illegitimate long before it becomes ineffective. And it can remain effective long after people stop believing in it. For a period of time, both realities coexist. The old world still functions. The new world already exists in people's minds. This creates a dangerous zone of uncertainty. A space between obedience and transformation. Between continuity and reinvention. Between what society officially is and what people increasingly believe it should become. That is the space where historical change accelerates. And it is also the space where guardians become most desperate. Because they are no longer defending the present. They are defending the future they expected to inherit. The empty throne now takes on a different meaning. Perhaps the greatest fear was never losing power. Perhaps the greatest fear was discovering that power had already begun losing its meaning. And if that is true, then an even deeper mystery emerges. What if Lady Catherine was reacting to something real? Not the collapse of society itself, but the arrival of a new reality that she could sense long before she could understand it. What if the most important thing Lady Catherine was protecting was not a hierarchy, not a family interest, and not even a social class, but a specific understanding of human nature itself? This is where the deeper revelation begins to emerge. Throughout this journey, we have treated the conflict as a struggle between competing visions of society. But beneath that lies a more fundamental disagreement. The real question is not how society should be organized. The real question is what kind of creatures human beings are. Because every social order is built upon an assumption about human behavior. Some systems assume people can govern themselves. Others assume they cannot. Some place their faith in individual judgment. Others place their faith in inherited wisdom, accumulated customs, and established boundaries. Lady Catherine embodies the second assumption. Her symbolic importance comes from what she represents at the level of civilizational psychology. She belongs to a worldview that sees restraint as protection rather than oppression. A worldview that views social structure not as a prison but as scaffolding. This creates a profound insight. Modern audiences often evaluate social systems according to whether they maximize freedom. Older systems were often evaluated according to whether they minimized chaos. Those are not the same objective. And they do not produce the same institutions. Imagine the invisible wall again. Earlier, It represented a boundary. Now it takes on a different meaning. What if the wall exists because someone once encountered a danger that future generations forgot? This is one of history's recurring patterns. Rules often survive longer than the memories that created them. Traditions remain even after their original justification disappears from public awareness. Eventually, people see only the restriction. They no longer see the catastrophe the restriction was designed to prevent. That does not automatically mean the rule is wise. But it does create a dangerous blind spot. People begin dismantling structures without fully understanding what those structures were originally solving. Here the contradiction becomes sharper. The defender of tradition can become trapped by the past. The reformer can become trapped by the future. One side overestimates continuity. The other overestimates transformation. And neither side possesses perfect knowledge. This uncertainty is what gives the conflict its enduring power. Because there is no position outside history from which anyone can safely judge the outcome in advance. Every generation stands before the same dilemma. Preserve too much, and society stagnates. Change too much, and society destabilizes. The deeper consequence is that civilization itself becomes an ongoing balancing act between memory and imagination. Between inherited knowledge and emerging possibility. Between the world that exists and the world that might exist. This is why another memory fragment becomes important: the old stone foundation beneath a grand estate. Most people admire the visible architecture. Few think about the foundation buried underneath. Yet the foundation determines what can safely be built above it. The same is true of cultures. The visible parts attract attention. The invisible assumptions carry the weight. And now we arrive at a revelation that changes how we see the guardian entirely. Perhaps Lady Catherine was not protecting a social order because she believed it was perfect. Perhaps she was protecting it because she believed imperfect order was still safer than uncertain transformation. If that is true, then her symbolic role becomes far more complex than most interpretations allow. Because the deepest conflict is no longer between privilege and freedom. It becomes a conflict between two competing fears. The fear of remaining trapped inside an outdated reality. And the fear of destroying a reality whose hidden purpose has not yet been fully understood. Which leads to a far more unsettling question. What if the structures people call oppressive are sometimes carrying burdens they were never designed to explain? And what if the greatest mistake is not preserving an old world or replacing it with a new one, but failing to understand what invisible problem the old world was trying to solve in the first place? What if the entire conflict has been misleading us from the beginning? What if the deepest lesson is not about whether old structures should survive or whether new ideas should replace them? What if the true revelation is that both sides are arguing about something neither side fully controls? This is the point where the hidden architecture of the story finally comes into view. The central conflict is not ultimately between two people. It is not even between two social classes. It is between two competing sources of legitimacy. One source derives authority from inheritance. The other derives authority from individual judgment. And the profound insight is that civilization has always depended on both. This is what many readers miss. Lady Catherine is not simply the defender of inherited legitimacy. Elizabeth is not simply the defender of personal authenticity. They are symbolic representatives of two forces that every society must somehow reconcile. One force preserves continuity. The other force creates adaptation. One force remembers. The other force discovers. One force asks, "What has already been tested?" The other asks, "What if the test itself is wrong?" The deepest revelation is that neither force can safely eliminate the other. A society built entirely on inheritance eventually loses the ability to respond to reality. A society built entirely on personal judgment eventually loses the ability to coordinate reality. This transforms the meaning of the invisible wall. Earlier it appeared as a boundary. Then it became a forgotten safeguard. Now it reveals its final symbolic form. The wall is not protecting one side from the other. The wall is managing tension between two truths that must coexist. Too much rigidity and the structure fractures under pressure. too much flexibility, and the structure dissolves into uncertainty. This is why the role of Lady Catherine carries a deeper significance than her immediate position within the story. Her legacy is not the preservation of status. Her legacy is the embodiment of a question every civilization eventually confronts. How much change can a system absorb before it ceases to be itself? That question extends far beyond literature. It appears in institutions, in traditions, in families, in cultures, even within individual human beings. Every person carries an internal version of the same conflict. Part of us depends on stable identity. Another part depends on growth. Part of us seeks continuity. Another part seeks transformation. The contradiction exists at every scale. The story becomes powerful because it mirrors a psychological reality hidden inside human nature itself. This leads to the most important memory fragment in the entire project. Imagine the empty throne again. Earlier it symbolized authority. Now it symbolizes something deeper. Not power. Not status. Legitimacy. The throne remains meaningful only as long as enough people believe it represents something worth preserving. The moment legitimacy disappears, power becomes performance. Influence becomes ritual. Structure becomes theater. And here the ultimate revelation emerges. Lady Catherine was never truly defending privilege. Privilege was merely the visible surface. What she was defending was legitimacy itself. She believed that once legitimacy begins to unravel, society enters a dangerous territory where nobody fully agrees on which rules matter, which authorities deserve trust, or which obligations remain binding. Whether that fear was justified is not the final point. The revelation is that her fear was rooted in a real civilizational problem. Every era eventually faces the same dilemma. Old sources of legitimacy weaken. New sources have not yet fully formed. The result is a period of uncertainty in which entire societies must renegotiate the foundations of reality. And that creates a consequence far larger than any individual conflict. Because if legitimacy is the invisible foundation beneath every institution, every tradition, and every shared belief, then the most important question is no longer what should change. The most important question becomes what can replace the thing that people have stopped believing in without causing the foundation itself to disappear? If legitimacy is the hidden foundation beneath every social order, then the most important question is not how it is created. The most important question is what happens after it begins to change. Because every transformation produces consequences that extend far beyond the people who first experienced them. This is where the lasting significance of the conflict emerges. The immediate struggle may appear confined to a particular place, a particular class, or a particular moment in history. But the deeper consequences continue moving long after the original participants are gone. That is the nature of civilizational change. The individuals become historical figures. The underlying tension remains. This is why the legacy of the Guardian is often misunderstood. People tend to remember those who accelerate change. They become symbols of progress, liberation, innovation, or reform. The Guardians rarely receive the same admiration. Yet their influence persists in a different way. Their legacy lies in the questions they force future generations to answer. They remind us that every new structure inherits responsibilities from the old one. Every transformation inherits risks as well as opportunities. This creates a consequence that extends beyond any single society. Human beings often assume that once an outdated system disappears, the problem it was managing disappears with it. History repeatedly demonstrates the opposite. The visible structure may vanish. The underlying challenge remains. A tradition disappears. The need for social trust remains. An institution loses authority. The need for legitimacy remains. A hierarchy weakens. The need for coordination remains. The forms change. The human requirements continue. This is where the image of the old stone foundation returns with greater force. Imagine an ancient building finally removed after generations of criticism. For a brief moment there is celebration. The structure is gone. The restriction has disappeared. The obstacle has been cleared away. But then a more difficult question emerges. What now carries the weight that the foundation once carried? That question represents one of the most important consequences in human history. Removing a structure and replacing its function are not the same thing. One is destruction. The other is creation. One is immediate. The other may take generations. This is why the conflict resonates so deeply with modern audiences. We live in an era where inherited authorities, established institutions, and traditional narratives are continually being questioned. Some deserve questioning. Some deserve revision. Some deserve replacement. Yet the underlying challenge remains unchanged. What mechanisms create trust after old sources of trust lose credibility? What creates shared meaning after old stories lose their power? What creates social cohesion when inherited assumptions no longer unite people? Suddenly the discussion expands beyond literature and enters the realm of human nature itself. Every person experiences a version of this process internally. Old beliefs collapse. New beliefs have not fully formed. Familiar identities weaken. New identities remain uncertain. The result is a period of psychological instability remarkably similar to the civilizational instability we have been exploring. The pattern repeats at every scale. Individual, family, institution, culture, civilization. That repetition may be the deepest legacy of all. The story endures because it reveals a permanent feature of human existence. We are constantly negotiating between continuity and transformation, between inherited meaning and emerging meaning, between stability and possibility. And perhaps that is why the empty throne remains such a haunting memory fragment. Not because someone lost the throne. Not because someone gained it. But because the throne asks a question that every generation eventually faces. Once the old source of legitimacy no longer commands belief, what new source can emerge that is strong enough to unite people without becoming the next structure destined to be challenged? Perhaps that is why this story continues to feel strangely alive long after the world that produced it has disappeared. Not because it gives us answers, but because it forces us to confront a tension that never truly goes away. Human beings do not simply live inside reality. We live inside interpretations of reality. We inherit maps created by people who came before us. Some of those maps guide us through uncertainty. Some outlive their usefulness. The challenge is that we rarely know which is which while we are living through the transition. That is why the most enduring symbol is neither a person nor an institution. It is the space between them. The invisible distance between the old stone foundation and the future structure that has not yet been built. The distance between the empty throne and whatever might someday replace it. The distance between certainty and possibility. In many ways, that space is where every generation finds itself. We often imagine history as a sequence of victories and defeats, of progress and resistance, of old worlds falling and new worlds rising. But the deeper reality may be more complicated. Every society is engaged in an ongoing conversation with its own past. Every generation inherits structures it did not create, benefits from sacrifices it did not make, and questions assumptions it did not choose. The result is a permanent human dilemma. We must decide what deserves preservation without becoming prisoners of preservation. We must embrace change without becoming intoxicated by change itself. That dilemma exists far beyond politics, institutions, or social systems. It exists within every individual life. Each person carries an invisible architecture of beliefs, habits, loyalties, and assumptions. Some provide stability. Some create limitations. Growth requires questioning them. Wisdom requires understanding them before we discard them. This may be the deepest human meaning hidden beneath everything we have explored. The conflict was never ultimately about a guardian and a challenger. It was about the relationship between memory and imagination. Memory reminds us that reality has consequences. Imagination reminds us that reality can be transformed. Without memory, we lose continuity. Without imagination, we lose possibility. The most resilient societies, like the most resilient people, are not those that choose one over the other. They are those that learn how to hold both at the same time. And so the final memory fragments remain. The invisible wall. The old stone foundation. The empty throne? None of them are important because of what they physically are. They matter because they represent questions that never stop returning. What should be protected? What should be changed? What hidden purpose lies beneath the structures we take for granted? What unseen cost accompanies the structures we are eager to replace? The story endures because those questions belong to every era. They belong to the past. They belong to the present. They will belong to the future. And perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the people history remembers as defenders of an old world and the people history remembers as builders of a new one were often responding to the same mystery from opposite directions. They were all searching for a form of legitimacy strong enough to hold human beings together, yet flexible enough to survive reality itself. And that leaves us with one final thought. The greatest challenge may not be deciding whether a world deserves to be preserved or transformed. The greatest challenge may be recognizing the precise moment when preserving it and transforming it become the very same act.